Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The tyrant is dead. Long live the tyrant. When Pisistratus died in 527 BC, his sons took over the tyranny. This is perhaps another of his legacies, a dynasty. And in this initial portion of the lecture, we're going to look at their rule and the fall of their tyranny at the hands of Sparta. And we're going to end this initial portion with some comments about the tyranny overall. Well, Pisistratus was succeeded by his sons Hippias and Hipparchus in some form of joint rule. Hippias was the dominant one in the sense that he was in control of political affairs. He was the elder, according to the Athenian constitution, as well as the one who was more public-spirited and sensible. That's a direct quote. Hipparchus was apparently puerile. He was more interested in the arts and partying than public life. He seems to have played more of a cultural role in the tyranny, perhaps akin to a kind of minister of culture, and that probably suited where his interest lay anyway. These two sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, continued their father's economic policies and indeed extended them. They were responsible, for instance, for developing the silver mines at Laurium, which was in the southeast of Attica. And these mines would produce the silver for Athens' first state coinage, the famous owls, in about 525 BC. On one side of the coin was the head of Athena, and on the other side was her symbol, the owl. And next to it are the first three letters of Athens, alpha, theta, eta, to show where the coins came from. An official coinage, of course, is fundamental to any economy. And so the sons of Pisistratus take great credit for how the economy was able to develop after their father's death. But these coins also, of course, had a propaganda function. Coins circulated so widely in the ancient world that they were a bit like a web page nowadays. Everyone would connect to these owls to Athens. And what is more, the previous coinage that some Athenians had been using had become obsolete, really, with the rise of this new state coinage. So this further centralizes the position of Athens in Attica. In foreign policy, thanks to worsening relations with Sparta and the Peloponnesus, the sons of Pisistratus fared less well. At some point, probably during their father's tyranny, that old Alcmeonidae family, which had become a real pain, was exiled. Now, we saw that this family had been exiled sometime after Cylon's coup in the 630s BC, but Solon had issued a general amnesty, you recall, during his archonship, and so therefore this family, the Alcmeonidae, had returned to Athens at that time. Now, though, during the Peisistratid tyranny, it was in exile again. We're not sure whether it was one of those families that voluntarily left into exile when Pisistratus seized power in 545 after the Battle of Pallene, or whether it was one of the families that he had kicked out. But either way, it doesn't really matter because he wasn't in Athens anymore. But this family, the Alcmeonidae, was intent on returning. And to this end, it would soon start to use Sparta to work towards bringing the tyranny in Athens to an end. Then in 514 BC, out of the blue, Hipparchus was murdered by two men. Their names were Harmodius and Aristogeiton, and the motive for the assassination is not known. And the Athenian constitution gets names confused, and it doesn't help by saying that it was a political affair as well as a personal one. Let us look at what the Athenian constitution has to say about the murder, because it is important for the turning point that it was in the tyranny. First of all, the personal reason. One of Pisistratus's other sons, a man named Thessalus, apparently fell in love with a young Athenian man named Harmodius. But the relationship didn't get anywhere. Harmodius rejected his advances. The Athenian constitution tells us about this, but unfortunately it has confused the name Thessalus with Hipparchus. So we're really talking about Hipparchus now, one of the two tyrants, lusting after Harmodius and getting nowhere. When Hipparchus was rejected, he got really angry about this, and he arranged for Harmodius's sister not to be a basket bearer in the procession that was a part of the Panathenaea festival. You remember we talked about the Panathenaea last time, that major festival in honor of Athena. And part of that festival was a procession of young virgin girls carrying baskets of the first fruits of their harvest. It was a big honor, it was important, and of course the implication of Hipparchus's act banning this sister of Harmodius from carrying a basket in the procession was that Harmodius's sister wasn't a virgin, and so therefore couldn't take part in this procession, and that was a big social affront. It would have made her basically kind of unmarriageable. It was a lot more serious than it might seem to us at first. And to make matters worse, Hipparchus slandered Harmodius to everyone he could. All of this caused Harmodius and his lover Aristogeiton, and obviously Aristogeiton would have been none too happy at somebody else trying to kind of take his lover away from him. It caused the two of them to plan to kill Hipparchus. So if you think that soap operas are far-fetched, they have nothing on the ancient Greeks. Well, that's the personal element. Now the political element. The Athenian constitution has been telling us about this personal angle, but then it adds the detail that Harmodius and Aristogeiton had, quote, many supporters, end quote. This may or may not mean anything. Perhaps Hipparchus had broken a few hearts around Athens. Perhaps he had angered no small number of lovers if he had had affairs with others, with their other halves. But when the Athenian constitution says this, it also adds the detail that Harmodius and Aristogeiton were waiting to attack Hippias by the Acropolis. And remember, the Acropolis is where the Panathenaic procession, that is the procession that's part of the Panathenaea in honor of Athena with the baskets, ended. Okay, so the procession will end at the Acropolis. It started off in the Agora area, that is the marketplace, and it ends at the Acropolis. And the Athenian constitution goes on to say that as they waited for Hippias, they saw one of their fellow conspirators chatting to him. Okay, they thought therefore wrongly that he was betraying the conspiracy to Hippias, and so in the confusion of the moment they rushed to the part of the Agora where Hipparchus was and prematurely killed him. Now, when they had done this, that is, when they had murdered Hipparchus as he was about to start off the procession, and Hippias would receive it by the Acropolis, when they had killed Hipparchus, Harmodius, one of the lover assassins, was killed on the spot. Okay, he was murdered on the spot. But the other one, Aristogeiton, was captured alive, and he was tortured to give up the names of the other conspirators. You can see that we may have a political motivation to the conspiracy, that it was meant to end the tyranny. Otherwise, why would Hippias have been targeted for the assassination, for what would seem otherwise to have been simply a personal matter involving Hipparchus? Okay, so if it was just this personal lovers' quarrel kind of thing, why kill both brothers, you see? Well, as for Aristogeiton, he was tortured, as I said, and he was keen to end his life, which is no surprise. He wanted to put an end to the torture. It must have been horrible. And so therefore he offered to betray more names if Hippias, that is, if the remaining tyrant brother, would shake his hand as a sign of good faith. Hippias immediately, without thinking, did this, and then Aristogeiton, blood-spattered and bruised, mocked him for shaking hands with the murderer of his own brother. Well, Hippias went ballistic at that, and he immediately grabbed a dagger from the scabbard of one of the guards standing nearby and stabbed Aristogeiton to death, which of course was precisely what Aristogeiton wanted. It would stop his torture. Now, there is no question that the assassination was a turning point in the Peisistratid tyranny. Gone was its benevolent nature from the days of Peisistratus, when everything seemed to be going so well, that apparent age of Chronos, remember, as the Athenian constitution puts it. After 514 BC, in other words, after Hipparchus's assassination, Hippias's rule became very harsh. He executed a number of people that he suspected had a hand in his brother's murder. Moreover, he decided he was going to move out of the city. And so he began to build a fortified compound on Munichia, which is a hill that overlooks the Piraeus, the port of Athens. And that is significant because that would allow him to get away easily, you see, if need be. He just needed to kind of, nip into the Piraeus, hop on a ship, and boom, he was gone. Well, at this point, the Alcmeonidae re-enter the picture. It's impossible to know whether they had anything to do with Hipparchus's murder, but certainly they helped to bring down Hippias a few years later in the year 510. 4 years after his brother's assassination, that is. And how did they do this? Well, political exploitation of religion again, you see. The Alcmeonidae agreed to fund the rebuilding of the temple of Apollo at Delphi. This was the major oracular site of the Greek mainland. It was where Apollo lived. The temple at some time earlier than this had burned down, but for some reason the people of Delphi had not rebuilt it. Rebuilding temples, of course, wasn't cheap. But this is surprising that such an important shrine would have not been rebuilt. If you recall, I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture that the Oracle of Delphi was now in the hands of the Amphictyonic League, those states that lived in and around Delphi. They administered it now. Now, this was the first sacred war, you recall. And the question, of course, is why didn't those states that were part of the League chip in and rebuild the temple? And we just don't know. Nevertheless, the temple had not been rebuilt, and so the family, the Alcmeonidae, now saw this as a way of gaining leverage over the priestess, that is the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, who gave the oracular utterances at the Oracle of Delphi, because now they offered to rebuild it, you see. And the Alcmeonidae were not doing this simply out of the goodness of their own pious hearts, but more for a political calculation. Rebuilding the temple, as I said, would give them leverage over the Pythia. What they now arranged was that every time an embassy came from Sparta to consult the oracle, the Pythia was going to add something to the answer. It didn't matter what the Spartans were consulting the oracle about. The Pythia was to add something at the end to every answer, and that something was Sparta must liberate Athens from tyranny. Okay, so a person may go to Delphi and say, I lost my dog. Where is he? And Apollo would speak through the goddess and say, well, look in your garage or something like that. But Sparta must liberate Athens from tyranny. This is similar, if you've studied Roman history, to Cato ending every speech in the Senate with the famous phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. Well, eventually, people would have gotten sick of hearing the same thing over and over again. It's like a broken record. The Romans certainly got sick of hearing Cato go on about that, and they ultimately did invade Carthage for no real good reason at all. Basically, picked a fight with them and destroyed Carthage in the year 146. But the Spartans also got tired of the same answer and over again. And so to shut the Pythia up, they decided that they were going to march on Athens. Another reason was that Athens had a growing friendship with the city-state of Argos in the northeast of the Peloponnesus. And we know just how much the Spartans were at loggerheads with the Argives. By now, in 510 BC, the Peloponnesian League, that is the league that the Spartans had put together and that we're going to discuss when we move to Sparta in this course next week. We're going to have a whole lecture just devoted to them. At this point, the Peloponnesian League was up and running. And although Sparta was starting to become a player in Peloponnesian politics, Argos was not a member of the Peloponnesian League, and it still continued to dominate much of the northeastern part of the Peloponnesus. It was always in danger then. It was always, I should say, a danger to Spartan growth in the Peloponnesus. It always was kind of an obstacle to that. So they had a political reason too then for marching on Athens, and that was to try to end the alliance between Athens and Argos. Well, in 510 BC, an initial Spartan expedition was sent by sea, but it was thwarted by the Athenians. You see, the Athenians were assisted by 1,000 cavalry fighters from Thessaly, an area that was to the north of Boeotia in the northern part of Greece. And the Thessalians, interestingly, were not a polis. They were what the Greeks called an ethne. They didn't live in the polis system. They had the kind of more looser kind of, confederation, if you like. Well, this Spartan reversal caused the Spartans to send their king Cleomenes at the head of a substantial force. So an initial Spartan reversal was met with more numbers. Cleomenes marched through the isthmus to Megara on the borders of Attica. He defeated the Thessalians who were trying to stop him from entering Attica, and then he marched on Athens itself and besieged Hippias and his sons on the Acropolis. When Hippias tried to smuggle his sons out of Attica, they were caught, and so he surrendered immediately to ensure their safety. And he agreed to leave Attica within 5 days, and he did so. He actually went to Sygia, up in the Troad region, which is in Asia Minor, and thus ended the Peisistratid tyranny. It didn't in the year 510. It is not the last we will hear about Hippias, and that is an interesting fact. He will come back to into the story, but many years later, 20 years later to be precise. Now, it's important to note that in this year, 510, it was a Spartan force, ultimately at the instigation of an exiled aristocratic family, the Alcmeonidae, that brought about the end of the tyranny. In other words, the ordinary Athenians did not bring about the end of the tyranny. They didn't topple Hippias. And you might be thinking, how could they anyway? In the last lecture, remember I said that Peisistratus had disarmed the people precisely because he didn't want them to rise against him. And he had that mercenary bodyguard, too, that walked around all the time behind him. Presumably that mercenary bodyguard continued to look after Hippias after his brother's assassination. In fact, we can imagine that he doubled it. There was only one of him, so that is one Hippias and one group of guards, and there were a lot of ordinary Athenian people. So ultimately, the numbers, you could say, had to have been in the favor of the people. That would have been the case, though, against Peisistratus as well, but the people never tried to depose Peisistratus, nor did they try to depose Hippias. And to me, this indicates that they accepted the rule of the Peisistratids because of the benefits it brought, you see. They accepted this despite the fact that any political experience that they had been gaining in the assembly after the time of Solon was curtailed. After all, the assembly didn't meet under a tyranny. They simply accepted the rule of the Peisistratids, even after 514, when Hippias began to rule very harshly. Incidentally, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, that is the two who murdered Hipparchus, and their deed, their assassination of Hipparchus, underwent a radical transformation in the memory of the democracy that followed in Athens. The two men became known as the tyrant slayers, and in the restoration of democracy that followed the tyranny, all sorts of songs were written about them. They became kind of like heroes. There is this enormous statue of them cast in bronze, and that was set up probably in the Agora to symbolize their valiant act in ending the tyranny. And one of the drinking songs that was written about them has actually been preserved in a most interesting way. It comes down to us as what is known as a scholion in an ancient manuscript. Scholia, that's the plural of scholion, are these marginal notes that people who copied over the manuscript would place into the margins, just like you might find notes in a library book. Somebody has scrawled in, hopefully in pencil, in the side of the the pages of the book. Well, as these manuscripts, got passed down and recopied over, those marginalia also would be copied over, those scholia. And one of them is the words of a drinking song that was written about the tyrant slayers, Harmodius and Aristogeiton. And I'm going to quote it to you right now. I will carry my sword in a bough of myrtle, the way Harmodius and Aristogeiton did when they murdered the tyrants and restored equality before the laws to Athens. Now, this is a remarkable misremembering of the deed. Let's not forget, Harmodius and Aristogeiton in 514 did not kill both tyrants. They only killed Hipparchus. And also, they didn't end the tyranny because it lasted for another 4 years until the Spartans toppled it. So here we have a nice distortion of history, as it were. Obviously, the scholion of this drinking song was to praise democracy, and the praise of Harmodius and Aristogeiton was here used to highlight how important democracy was. That's what the later Athenians believed in more than anything else. Mention oligarchy to them, and they would, bristle. So Harmodius's and Aristogeiton's deed was made into something that it really wasn't in fact, but it was done so for it was made into something for a kind of patriotic effect. Another side, perhaps another explanation, is perhaps the Athenians wanted to downplay the role that their enemy Sparta had in ending the tyranny. In other words, one of the reasons for the rewriting of history might have been because they didn't want to be seen as the Spartans bringing down the tyranny. They wanted to kind of be self-liberators. Well, whatever the case of that may be, I will now make some concluding remarks about the Peisistratid tyranny overall and its place in Athenian history. We certainly can applaud Peisistratus and his sons for how they benefited the city economically. We can applaud them for their patronage of the arts, and certainly they were cultured and lovers of arts themselves. Remember, Hipparchus was described as Philomusos, but appearance was very different from reality. Was Peisistratus really this conscious social and economic reformer who became tyrant because he genuinely wanted to help the people, because he genuinely wanted to alleviate their sufferings? Or did he cynically exploit the situation, that is, cynically exploit the faction fighting that was going on and the popular discontent so that he could grab power and do what he wanted to do as tyrant? Well, as much as I like Peisistratus, and I really do, as much as I like Peisistratus, I have to unfortunately go with the latter one, the cynical explanation or the cynical exploitation of faction fighting that he made. We mustn't forget that Peisistratus came to power by defeating the army of the Eupatridae, who were then in control of Athens, and this was at the Battle of Pellene in 545 BC. He marched on Athens at the head of a mercenary army. And afterwards, when he had actually seized Athens, he maintained his power by expelling any noble family that opposed him, and several hundred of these went into exile. Some would have done so voluntarily, saying, "We don't want to stay here anymore." Others, though, he did exile by force. Those families that chose to stay, in other words, the ones that he allowed to stay, he muzzled them and controlled them because he took as hostage their sons, and he deposited them with his friend and ally Lygdamus, the tyrant of Naxos. Naxos is a little island not too far away from Athens. So it's kind of interesting, actually, that Lygdamus in turn supported another man named Polycrates, who was a tyrant of the island of Samos, further to the east in the Aegean. And that meant that Peisistratus was part of a support network, really, for tyrants. He had all these tyrant alliances, rather than being allies with other polis, which would be more normal. Another polis, for example, wouldn't come to the aid of a tyrant, but another tyrant would. Peisistratus, therefore, knew what he was. He knew that if he ever needed help, he could not rely on the help of regular polis, and instead would need other tyrants to support him. And so he made his network of alliances very carefully. Remember also that he disarmed the people to try at least to offset any opposition to himself. He took the people's arms and he locked them away. He went everywhere with his own private mercenary bodyguard, and this bodyguard he paid for himself. It was made up of Scythian archers, that is, non-Greeks. He probably hired these during his time of exile, since he was up in Thrace, where the Scythians were, for quite some time. That is basically modern-day Bulgaria. And he would have come into contact with the Scythians there. And these Scythians archers are depicted on pottery of this period, and they're shown by their very colorful and elaborate cloaks. It is rather an interesting fact that after the tyranny was deposed, the Scythian archers remained in the city, and eventually they became part of a force that defended the city's walls during the classical period. Obviously, not the original Scythian archers. We're talking about sons and grandsons and so forth. And here's another interesting thing. The sons of the hostages that were deposited with Lygdamus on Naxos, what happened to them? Well, we don't know. They disappear from history. Sort of a Twilight Zone moment. Did they come back to Athens? Did they die on Naxos? We simply don't know. Well, Peisistratus took measures to ensure that opposition to himself were minimal and that his person was protected at all times. So he knew he had come to power by force, and he had to make sure that he maintained that power by muzzling the people. While he did not abolish the Solonian constitution, he did put it on the back burner, though. For example, he held archon elections, but he controlled them to ensure that his own supporters were elected. The ecclesia, that is the assembly, and the Boule, the council, didn't meet, and that meant that any political experience that the people had started to gain in the assembly or even in the Boule, as Solon had planned, was curtailed during the tyranny. The Peisistratids could not afford the assembly to meet, obviously, and they didn't, to have a bunch of citizens sitting around discussing politics en masse and deciding things. That's not something any tyrant could brook. And so they took steps to ensure that the mass of people stayed out of Athens. This introduction of the deme, or town justices, is an example of just that, I think. Yes, it enhanced the legal rights of the people. That is true, because now justice was taken to the people. You remember this term, the assizes. We talked about these kind of traveling courts where judges would go around from deme to deme and adjudicate various different disputes that people had. But at the same time, though, it was a means of keeping the people on their farms and out of the city, keeping them away from the center of political life. So too were his loans to farmers to help them through the period that it took for the olive trees to mature. The Athenian constitution notes this. It says that Peisistratus's purpose in olives and deme judges was twofold. One was to help the people survive and to keep them in the countryside where they would be busy with their own affairs, and so not to have the time to worry about getting involved in public affairs. In other words, political affairs. And this view is very much a later one. It's very much of the 4th century, at the time when the Athenian constitution was written. In the 320s BC, when the Athenian constitution was written, Greek autonomy was no more. Greece was now part of the Macedonian Empire. So the author of this work, the Athenian constitution, could look back at the entire sweep of Athenian history, and he could make these sorts of judgments. And what you have, with the benefit of hindsight, is the conclusion that he comes to. Remember also that the Athenian constitution was a product of Aristotle's school, and Aristotle had very strong views on the role of the people in a democracy. He basically he felt that they shouldn't have a role. He said in a number of his works that the best place for the people was working their lands. For example, in the Politics, he wrote, quote, "The best type of citizen body is agricultural, for owing to its not having much property, it lacks leisure, so that it is unable frequently to attend the ecclesia," the assembly, end quote. So Peisistratus's measures were meant to muzzle the political power of the people. They were meant to keep them on their land, and so too busy to keep them busy to worry about, too busy to worry about political affairs. Aristotle would have approved then of Peisistratus. And this gets me to another of my thoughts about this whole thing when I think about Peisistratus. And I kind of foreshadowed this at the end of the last lecture. Perhaps this is why the Athenian constitution calls Peisistratus's tyranny a golden age. The phrase, I think, may have nothing to do with peace and prosperity or the official text of Homer, but rather it may be because the Athenian constitution can now look back at the whole span of Athenian history. And as it is being written at a time when the people have been sovereign in the state under what was called radical democracy. And that type of democracy had been a disaster for Athens, as we'll see. It is the radical democracy that led to Athens' defeat at the hands of Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And therefore, for the Athenian constitution, what made Peisistratus's rule a golden age is that the people were not sovereign in the state. Okay, that Peisistratus had taken measures to muzzle their political power. I think that may be the reason why the very kind of aristocratically inclined Aristotelian school may look at the rule of Peisistratus favorably. At the heart of Peisistratus's policies certainly was the increased centralization of Athens and Attica. This was only possible by combating the influence of the aristocrats in the various areas of Attica. And his exploitation of religion was meant to achieve just that. We talked about his favoring of pan-Athenian cults. We talked about the creation of the Dionysia, the festival in honor of Dionysius, the people's god. It was what he did with these festivals too that would have endeared him to the people. You remember the old Roman expression, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, which of course means that if you want to keep the people happy, give them a lot of free food and mindless entertainment, and they wouldn't make too much of a fuss about things. Peisistratid was the precursor of this Roman tradition, to call it that, because while the people were in Athens at the festivals, remember, they were only brought into Athens on his terms, and the rest of the time they were on their lands. They got to eat for free, they got to drink for free, they got to run amok and go get free entertainment, rhapsodic contests, at the Panathenaea, hearing Homer recited, or a tragedy being performed at the city of Dionysia. They came to see firsthand how Peisistratid was promoting the grandeur and power of Athens. How would anybody want to change a regime like that? It seems like it couldn't have been better. Why would the ordinary people want to try to bite the hand that fed them, that is? That is why I think it was not them, but it was an exiled aristocratic family, the Alcmeonidae, and an opposing state, Sparta, that ultimately toppled the tyranny, and not the people. The people liked Peisistratid. We can understand this, I think. We can understand how the people reconciled themselves to Peisistratid's tyranny, even though the political advances that had been a part of Solon's constitution were now curtailed under his rule. Nevertheless, problems arose again. And in 510 BC, after Hippias was expelled from Athens, the broken record of Athenian history began again. Faction fighting broke out again. Stasis, this is the Greek word for this faction fighting between different political groups inside of the city of Athens. What Peisistratid had tried to do to end faction strife in the various areas of Attica now was seen to have failed. Once again, we see competition for the archonship, the eponymous archonship. Once again, we hear about fighting for that eponymous archonship that was the most important of the three offices, the three archonships. When Hippias was deposed, we find that two people in particular were competing for the eponymous archonship. One was a man named Isagoras, and another was a fellow named Kleisthenes, a member of the Alcmeonidae family. And to cut a very long story short, Kleisthenes is going to emerge as the victor, and he's going to introduce legislation in the year 508 BC that will take Athens in a radically new direction as far as democracy goes. And it is to Kleisthenes that we are now going to turn, and we're going to consider why he, and not Solon, is sometimes referred to as the father of democracy. Well, the period of Peisistratid tyranny might have given Athens some relief from the faction fighting, as we've seen. But the fall of that tyranny in 510, with the expulsion of Hippias, led to almost immediate clashes between noble families, the sorts of clashes that have been constant throughout Athenian history in our course. Factional strife, stasis among powerful families, as I called it, sounds like a broken record to us. Will it ever end? And yes, it will. It will end, and we will see how and why it will end right now in this second part of the lecture. It ends thanks to this man, Kleisthenes, and his round of democratic legislation in the year 508. Well, when Hippias was expelled from Athens in 510, Kleisthenes, who, as I said before, was a member of that powerful Alcmeonidae family, together with a certain Isagoras, whom the Athenian constitution says was a friend of the tyrants, went head-to-head. Their struggle was centered once again on that all-important office, the eponymous archonship. Kleisthenes evidently was losing out because Isagoras was elected archon for 508. Elections for the archonship took place the year previously. So in 510, if we just recap the chronology for a moment, Hippias was expelled in 509. Archon elections were held, and presumably it was Kleisthenes versus Isagoras, and Isagoras was elected archon and became archon for the year 508. Isagoras' days, though, were numbered because he enlisted the support of Sparta to help him maintain his power. This is rather odd. A Spartan force, again under King Cleomenes, the same king who had expelled Hippias in 510 BC, and another Spartan force invaded Athens for the second time in as many years. They expelled 700 Athenian noble families that Isagoras had named, and the Spartans tried to set up an oligarchy of 300 men headed by none other than Isagoras. So it doesn't appear as if Isagoras was going to be content with the 1-year constitutional office that was the archonship. It looks rather as if he were after being set up as a tyrant of Athens, or rather as some kind of head of an oligarchy. It doesn't really matter, though, because Cleomenes' invasion, and especially the attempt to set up an oligarchy, proved too much, and the Athenians rebelled. They besieged Isagoras and Cleomenes on the Acropolis for 2 days. And they actually climbed up the walls and were besieging them inside of those buildings. They forced their surrender on the 3rd day of the siege, and the 2 of them were forced to leave Athens. According to the Athenian constitution, the resistance to Cleomenes and Isagoras began with the Boule, the council, and then it spread to the people as a whole. This is important for the political power of the people at this time, because this council, as the Athenian constitution calls it, could not be the Areopagus. Okay, they would, of course, been in favor of an oligarchy. Naturally, this would have held many supporters of Isagoras. It was it was hardly likely to launch some sort of attempt against him. So the council then, as I say, had to have been the Boule, the council of 400, you remember, established by Solon, which was the executive arm of the ecclesia, the assembly. This was more representative of the people as a whole, and we can understand it was more likely to lead opposition. The Boule had evidently resurrected itself fairly quickly, along with the ecclesia, no doubt, when the tyranny fell in 510. It is the Boule, then, that seemed to have rallied the people against Cleomenes and the threat of oligarchy. And so we have this essentially democratic uprising against the threat of oligarchical power. And this speaks volumes for the power of the people compared to what their power had been before the time of Solon. After Cleomenes and Isagoras left Athens, the people recalled Kleisthenes. When Kleisthenes had lost out during the struggles for the archonship previously, he had been forced to withdraw from Attica. We don't know exactly how that happened, but he had been ejected, presumably by Isagoras. Now, however, Kleisthenes was recalled by the people, and it is probably at this time that those families that Isagoras had asked Cleomenes to exile also returned. The people as a whole, that means the assembly, the ecclesia, made Kleisthenes, quote, leader and champion of the people. That is a direct quotation from the Athenian constitution. And I have to say it again, because it is an incredible thing when we think about the implications of this quotation. For the power of the people, the assembly, the ecclesia made Kleisthenes, according to the Athenian constitution, quote, leader and champion of the people. And furthermore, quote, it placed all their trust in him, end quote. This isn't a surprise. The Athenian constitution also tells us that, quote, he took the people into his group, end quote, into his following, we might say. He was obviously losing out to Isagoras at the time, and he appealed to the people. In other words, he went after the people's support in his clash with Isagoras. Presumably, he promised them more democratic legislation and then remembered that promise. Incidentally, in the phrase, he took the people into his group, or he took the people into his following, I hesitate to say that he attached the people to his party. This is sometimes how this part of the Athenian constitution is translated. He attached the people to his party. I don't like that word party, because it conjures up the idea of modern political parties like the Democrats or the Republicans, one being the party in power and the other being one of the opposition or whatever, each with its own platform, organization, constitution, agenda, and so forth. There was nothing like this, even in the developed Athenian democracy. In fact, even our own founding fathers of this country decried the idea of parties. They were totally against them. They referred to them as factions inside of their own private writings. I think they would have been very disappointed to find out that not long after their experiment, parties became the norm. We might even just stop and think about that. Why do you think it is that everywhere there is democracy in the world, everybody goes immediately for parties and not just individuals? Well, I'll leave you to think about that. In fact, how Athenian politicians marshaled their support is a bit of a mystery. It would certainly make an excellent PhD dissertation topic. For our purposes, though, to put it crudely, Kleisthenes appealed to the people to support him in overthrowing Isagoras. And in return for his back-scratching, this back-scratching, he presumably promised to scratch their backs with popular legislation. Okay, so he appealed to the people and said, if you support me, then I'll do a bunch of things that you want. And the situation, therefore, in 508 is that the Athenians brought him back, and they gave him some type of extraordinary power to fix the faction fighting that was ever present in Athenian affairs, and that caused such disruption to all sectors of society. Now, Kleisthenes was not an archon, and it had to be the assembly, the ecclesia, doing this. When the Athenian constitution talks about the people, it means people in the technical sense of the assembly, the ecclesia. You see, in Greek, there's two distinct words. When you talk about the people in organized for political purposes, it is the word demos. Okay, this is the term that is always found. This is the word that is found, obviously, at the origin of the word democracy, the power of the people, the power of the demos. It is quite distinct from the word that is used for the people, for a large group of people in general, which is the word laos. Okay, and incidentally, that is always the term that is found in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. When we refer to the congregation of Israel, for instance, it is the laos tes Israel. And never the demos. The demos has this distinctly political character to it. It's a very technical term. Well, the ecclesia, the assembly, asked Kleisthenes to be under Solon to fix things. The huge difference between Solon and Kleisthenes was that it was the people now, not the ruling aristocrats or the eupatridae, that gave Kleisthenes this mandate. Hadn't the people come a long way since the days before 594? Yes, indeed they had. But how could Kleisthenes fix things when others before him had failed? Well, Peisistratid tried to neutralize aristocratic power in Attica, given how the aristocrats had dominated the areas in which they lived. The ordinary people were intimidated by their aristocratic neighbors. They kept looking to them for help, looking to them for support. Peisistratid, as we've talked about previously in our last lecture, tried to centralize the power of Athens. He tried to centralize Athens in Attica to make the people look to Athens, not to the local aristocrats, and he had failed. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been such faction fighting and the sort of problems that occurred when the tyranny failed. How could Kleisthenes fix the problem? He fixated on making the people no longer intimidated by the aristocrats in the areas in which they lived. He fixated on this by forgetting about centralizing Attica and Athens. That would come as a matter of course. What he wanted to do was to make the aristocrats impotent politically. Kleisthenes' legislation altered existing social conditions. It put an end to the influence of the aristocratic power bases in Attica. Surprise, surprise, an end to the influence of aristocratic power bases, except for his family, the Alcmeonidae. He wouldn't, of course, try to neuter them, but we have to expect some kind of personal benefit here. His legislation was wide-sweeping, as was Solon's, and we're going to consider each aspect of it, the political, the social, and the economic, separately. We're also going to consider the view that it is Kleisthenes and not Solon who should be labeled the father of democracy. But we'll pick up on more of that in the next lecture. At this point, we just have to begin with, I'll just leave you with that question for now. Kleisthenes took democracy to the masses in a way that Solon did not. So does that make him the father of democracy? Let's remember that and kind of keep that question in the back of our minds as we track through the rest of this lecture and look at what the political legislation of Kleisthenes entailed. Now, I have to warn you, this is complicated. This is going to be a tough rest of the lecture here. we're going to be looking at a lot of a lot of strange terms, and the development of democracy was really almost kind of like a mathematical kind of level of complexity here. In a nutshell, Kleisthenes mixed up the population of Attica. The entire population of Attica was now put into 10 new tribes. Okay, they were organized into 10 new tribes. Now, how he did this was to take the 4 existing tribes, these were the so-called 4 Ionian tribes that had been there for centuries, and to create 10 new ones, just like that. Nobody knows why he came up with the number of 10. He just did it. Then he further divided Attica into a number of administrative areas. The idea being that people's loyalty would no longer be to the aristocrats living in their towns, but their loyalty would now be to their tribes, because he put the people into these 10 new tribes, and therefore they could find solidarity with their tribe. Since members of the tribe would come from different parts of Attica, some people living in one town wouldn't be intimidated, because they could now call on their fellow tribesmen who were living in other areas of Attica for support. The people continued living in the same towns as before. There's a bit of a controversy about how many towns there were in Attica. Some people would argue for 169, others put the number as few as 139. Let's just stick with a number more than 100 and less than 170. That way we can't go wrong. Now, he didn't move people from one town to another. Okay, he didn't revolutionize things in that to that degree. People did continue living in the same towns as before, so there was no population displacement or anything like that. But individuals living in these towns now became part of a geographically scattered tribe. That's the nutshell. Now I want to expand upon it. Kleisthenes divided Attica into 3 regions: the city, the coast, and the inland. We can see a bit of a similarity in these names with the 3 groups before the days of Peisistratid. Remember, the men from the plain, the men from the coast, and the men from behind the hills. These are somewhat similar to these to the tribes. I'm sorry, to the geographical groups that Kleisthenes is now going to organize people into. The city was the area in which the city of Athens and its suburbs were situated. Kleisthenes' city then was the city of Athens and its immediate suburbs. Kleisthenes' coast now ran along the entire coastline of Attica. In other words, it ran west and south of Athens to Cape Sunion, right at the tip of the Attic promontory, and then around the eastern coastline of Attica. It really was all the coast. And Kleisthenes inland, remember the old group was called the men beyond the hills, it's now the inland. This was now the chunk that was left. So in other words, it was the chunk of land in between the western, southern, and eastern coastal areas, up to the top of Attica, up to where its borders were with Boeotia, which is up over here, if you look on the screen. There was a bit of an overlap between the pre-Peisistratid areas and the new ones of Kleisthenes, but Attica now stayed divided by this Kleisthenic system for the rest of its history. Kleisthenes then subdivided each region. So we have our 3 regions, the city, the coast, and the inland. He subdivided these regions into, each of these 3 regions into 10 parts. And the Greek word for this are trities. That meant that Attica was now divided into 30 parts. In other words, 10 parts for the city, 10 for the coast, 10 for the inland. 10 times 3 equals 30. You can't confuse me on that one. Now, but don't confuse these 10 trities, or parts per region, with the 10 tribes. That's something different. We're talking about trities here. To use the modern analogy, it might not work, but it does get the idea across. Compare this division to the states and counties within the United States of America. Each state is divided into a number of counties or parts. These regions would not be the same size. Obviously, the city was smaller than the other 2 regions, and the inland would probably have been the largest, although each of them would have the same number of trities in them, 10 for each. These trities wouldn't be the same size, and they wouldn't have the same population, because some areas would have more towns than others. If I can try to use a modern analogy again, think of, say, Maine, Texas, and Missouri. I just named these 3 because they're all different sizes. nothing to do with the coast of Maine or something like that. Think of Maine, Texas, and Missouri as the three regions of America, and each one of these is divided into 10 tritias. Given the size of these states, or rather regions, some tritias would be larger than others, and others would be smaller, depending on geographical features and population. We have now Attica divided into the city, the coast, and the inland regions, each region subdivided into 10 tritias. So Attica becomes divided into 30 tritias altogether. Now for the next phase. I told you it was complicated. The Athenians had long been divided into these 4 Ionian tribes, and that was why the Selonian Boule was made up of 400 men, 100 from each of the tribes. Well, Kleisthenes expanded the number of tribes, as I said just a moment ago, from 4 to 10, and he gave each of his new tribes an eponymous hero that he, Kleisthenes, chose himself. In other words, he gave the new tribes pedigree. There was a tribe called the Erecthidae. This tribe was named after Erechtheus, who was one of the kings of Athens. According to mythology, Erechtheus sacrificed his daughters to save Athens, and so a temple to Erechtheus, the Erechtheum, on the Acropolis stood as a tribute to him. There was another tribe too, the Antiochid tribe, which traced its ancestry to Antiochus, the son of Hercules, or Heracles in Greek. You get some idea of what I'm talking about. Nobody for a second would have thought that the tribe that they were now placed into actually went back to mythological times. But Kleisthenes was trying to give the tribes some pedigree so that people would have some sense of belonging and pride because they hearkened back to what they might have thought of as the good old days of Athens, if you like. Kleisthenes now turned to the towns of Attica. These towns were 139, or as I said, 169. Some of these towns were in the city region, others in the coastal region, and the rest were in the inland region. Now we get to the core of what Kleisthenes was really up to, because what he did now was he put towns from different parts of each region into a specific tritis, and then he assigned tritias, the plural, from different regions to the 10 tribes. I warned you it was hard to get a handle on what Kleisthenes did, at least the first time around. Let me try to explain this in a bit more detail. What I'm going to say for the next 2 or 3 minutes, I should tell you, I'm not making things up, but about what was going on in ancient Greek history. Now, let me give you an imaginary sort of way that this might have worked. This part is kind of just sort of made up for the sake of illustrating the point. Kleisthenes might have taken towns in the city region that begin with, say, beta, towns that began with the letter kappa, and towns that began with omicron, and assigned them all to tritis 1. These towns were in different parts of the city region. For example, towns that began with beta could be to its north, towns that began with kappa could be to its southwest, and towns that began with omicron could be to the east. It really doesn't matter. The bottom line is that they were in different parts of that region, and he put them together now to make up tritis 1. So the area that was designated as tritis 1 came into being. Then he might have taken towns that began with alpha, towns that began with theta, and towns that began with sigma, and he assigned them to tritis 2. And he did the same thing to that city region until he had his 10 tritias. And then he did the same thing with the coast and inland regions, so that by the time he finished, all the towns in Attica, all from different parts of their regions, were divided among the 30 tritias, 10 per region. Each region had a different number of towns in it because of its size, just as if you divided up Texas, Maine, and Missouri into an equal number of tritias, you'd have a different number of towns in each one. So where are we when we get to all of this? Well, I'll try to give you a modern example to try to clarify the relationship between towns and tritias and regions. We live in New York City, which is part of New York State. Okay. So New York City, that would be like the town. Well, actually, no. Let me put it a different way. I live in Queens, which is part of New York City. So Queens would be like the town. New York City would be like the county, and New York State would be like the region. Okay, that would be kind of like the idea. But while people living in 2, 3, 5, or half a dozen towns found themselves suddenly being part of the same treatise, so what? Their towns hadn't moved. They were still living in the same house. And that theoretically meant that any aristocrats in town alpha of the inland could still dominate the ordinary people in that town, just as any aristocrats in towns beginning with lambda or of the coast region could do the same thing. Well, Kleisthenes hadn't finished yet. Remember those 10 new tribes? Well, what he did now was to take one treatise from each region and assign it to a tribe, so that each tribe became composed of 3 different tritiaes. For example, and again, I'm just making these numbers up. Don't look at these numbers as anything more than illustrations. He might have taken city treatise 1 and coast treatise 4 and inland treatise 8 to make tribe 1. Then he might have taken city treatise 5 and coast treatise 9 and inland treatise 1 to make tribe 2, and so forth, until he had assigned all tritiaes to his 10 tribes. And now a treatise from one region was combined with another one from a different region, and then yet another one from the third region. And these 3 different geographical tritiaes together formed a tribe. Each tribe would have had in it a different number of towns, depending on how many towns there were in the various tritiaes of that tribe. Building on the system, Kleisthenes created assemblies for each tribe and for each town with regular meetings. So each of these 10 new tribes now had its own ecclesia, its own assembly, the tribal assembly, which decided matters that affected the tribe, and it reported to the Athenian assembly, the major ecclesia. Moreover, it was the tribal assembly that elected the members of the Boule by lot. Now Kleisthenes increased the Boule to 500 at this point, 50 men from each of the 10 new tribes. And we'll talk about the Boule a little bit more later. Now, though, let's go to the town level. Each town now had its own demarch, a official in charge of it, like a modern-day mayor. The name demarch is the word in Greek deme, and then archon, kind of like the ruler of the town. And remember Peisistratid's deme justices? Well, the justices that had traveled from town to town, each town also now had its own assembly, a bit like a modern city council. And that deme or town assembly decided matters that affected that town and reported to its tribal assembly. All of the officials wanting to take part in the political process had to be elected, of course, but this new system gave people more protection thanks to the tribes. It allowed all citizens, regardless of where they lived in Attica, it didn't matter if they were coastal, inland, or in the city, all citizens now were able to take part in the political process on a far wider basis than they'd been able to in the Selonian constitution. And they were able to do so because of the tribal assemblies that also elected representatives to the Boule. You can argue, and I do, that in the town, tribal, and polis assemblies, that is all 3, the town assembly, the tribal assembly, and the big one in Athens, what we have, in effect, in this 3-tier hierarchy is the ancestor of the sort of administration that we take for granted today, the sort of hierarchy of administration that is local, state, and federal administration. I don't think that is far-fetched at all. Even if the mechanics of it are different from then as opposed to now, I think that is very much an antecedent to our ways of running things. The assigning of towns to tritiaes and tritiaes to tribes sounds very arbitrary. It sounds like Kleisthenes has gone totally crazy. And if you couldn't follow everything I said in the past 15 minutes, please don't worry about it. Just drop it. You don't need to know all of those details if it was hard to grasp. We don't know where he got his idea for this from. We don't know if he did really go insane, but I don't think he did. It looks arbitrary, but it's not. There was nothing arbitrary actually about his system. It's a brilliant system. Kleisthenes didn't sit down with a sketch pad and draw 9 lines or however many are needed to divide each region into 10. And then he didn't just stick towns in them willy-nilly. He had a clear method to his apparent madness. because what Kleisthenes had done was not merely redraw boundary lines, as city councils do all the time. No, in redrawing the map of Attica, what Kleisthenes had done was to make the tribes consist of people living in different areas of Attica, and therefore owed their allegiance, their loyalty to their tribe, and no longer to the aristocratic overlords that were living in their home areas. It didn't really matter now if Ned, let's just take a good Greek name like that, who lived in the inland, was being intimidated in some way by aristocratic Joe, because Ned might have been intimidated by Joe, but now Ned's fellow tribesmen who live in a different area of Attica, far away from aristocrat Joe, were not now being intimidated by him, and they're not, and they are going to come to Ned's help. And I want to pick up on that in a moment. But I just mentioned, though, earlier that Kleisthenes introduced a wide array of legislation, not just political stuff. And I want to discuss Kleisthenes' other legislation right now. And then by way of kind of rounding off our discussion of Kleisthenes, we're going to try to answer those two big questions. First, did he do what he did because he was a genuine reformer, because he cared about the people and their political rights? That is one question. And the second question is, should he and not Solon really be labeled as the father of democracy? Now, I realize this has been a tough part of the lecture, and I'm sorry about that. I promise, no, what we're going to talk right now is not as tough, although if you need to pour yourself a nice drink, you can do that right now. Well, just to kind of conclude our discussion about Kleisthenes, by looking at what his division of Attica meant, we will consider other aspects of his legislation and then end with the answers, try to answer those questions about his motives and whether he deserves the label of father of democracy. We've surveyed how Kleisthenes divided Attica up and scattered the people among 10 new tribes. The idea being to protect the ordinary people from the oppression of local aristocrats. And it was also to cut down on faction fighting, as we'll talk about in a moment. But also in tandem with this reform, that is, this redivision of Attica, was his move to change the way the people referred to themselves. Now, the norm up until this time was for an Athenian to call himself by his given name and that of his father. So what we might call the patronymic, right? So Ned, son of George. Now, Kleisthenes ordered that the patronymic be switched for the demotic. That is, in other words, the town where the person came from. Demotic comes from this word deme, town. So Ned, son of George, would now become Ned from Marathon, for example, Marathon being in Eastern Attica. Now, this seems an odd change to us, you know. We tend not to call ourselves, you know, I don't refer to myself as Matthew of Queens. What's Kleisthenes getting at here? I think that what we have to see in this measure is an attempt to promote social and economic equality, to try to reduce the name power of those with aristocratic backgrounds. The other side of this coin, however, and this is what the Athenian constitution tells us, is this was a way of masking whether you were an old or a new Athenian citizen. Ned from Marathon could be anyone. He might have belonged to an Athenian family that went back to the Bronze Age, or he could have moved to Athens from somewhere even outside Attica when Solon was offering citizenship to foreign craftsmen. You just didn't know anymore. Calling yourself by your given name and demotic now remained the norm in Athenian society. Occasionally, we find men who called themselves by their patronymic, the name of their father, and the demotic. For example, the great 4th century BC orator and statesman Demosthenes, whom we will meet much later in our course, he regularly called himself Demosthenes, son of Demosthenes from Paeonia. Paeonia was the deme on the other side of Mount Hymettus. But when this happened, that is, when people called themselves by their demotic and patronymic, they were usually the more aristocratic or politically ambitious men. They wanted people to know their backgrounds because this would help them acquire political influence. It's just like today, you know, if we hear about someone proposing policy or standing for the Senate or something, and he's called Joe Blow, you know, that's one thing. And then we hear about a Kennedy, we know immediately, you know, who comes from the better family, as it were, in quotation marks. And the Athenians were no different. So what did Kleisthenes' division of Attic society really mean? Why did he do it? You've probably already gotten onto why he did it. I gave it away before, and I also intimated it a few moments ago. He had broken down the aristocrats' influence in the areas of Attica. That was the big motivation. How, though, had he protected the ordinary people from exploitation? That's what it was all about. The answer lies in the way he put people from different towns into the same tribes. And as a result, people from different parts of Attica, nobles and non-nobles, were merged together via Tritias into a new and different tribe. That meant people who were being intimidated by aristocrats in the areas of Attica in which they lived, or who were suffering hardship from faction competition, for example, could now appeal to their fellow tribesmen and their tribal assembly for help. They could appeal to people, that is, who were not under the sway of oppressive nobles in one town or the other, or in one area or another, because while they were all members of the same tribe now, they lived in different areas of Attica. Hence, they could champion the grievances of their fellow tribesmen elsewhere without any fear of repression or whatever back home. Someone who was being hard pressed, say, in a town in the inland region, could now appeal to fellow tribesmen who might be living in the city region or the coastal region, and geographically, they were far removed from the problem. They didn't need to worry about oppression at this local level, at the level where their fellow tribesmen were having a good time. I'm sorry, having a hard time. So they could help them out, and the tribal assembly could help them out. People's loyalties also switched to their tribal assembly, and this is terribly important. This is what really sets apart Kleisthenes' legislation from that of Solon. The aristocrats might well have tried to dominate the assembly when it came to tribal business. This is the tribal assembly we're talking about. But these aristocrats in reality were now only part of the mass of the voters, and non-nobles would always outnumber nobles. So that meant that while our aristocrats might have tried to throw their weight around in the tribal assembly, and I'm sure they did, human nature being what it is, they would have found themselves outnumbered by non-nobles who might automatically have taken the opposite stance to what the nobles were taking. More than that, as we've said before, these tribal assemblies elected their tribes' representatives to the Boule in Athens. If you remember, Kleisthenes had increased the number of the Boule to 550 men from each of the 10 new tribes. Although members of the Boule still had to be over the age of 30, and although the Thetes were still excluded, there was intense competition for this Boule, the council Boule. Apart from preparing the agenda of the assembly and its pro-Bouletic function of discussing business before assembly meetings and then issuing its resolutions to the assembly, the Boule was destined to become one of the most important organs of the fully developed constitution. It met more frequently than the assembly. It met practically every day, and so it could deal with business far quicker than the assembly. As I think, as I've mentioned before, the Attic year was divided into 10, not 12 months as we have. So each Attic month was approximately 6 weeks. The assembly met 4 times a month, so that's about once every 1.5 weeks, give or take. The Boule, on the other hand, was meeting practically every day, apart from the festival days and the days of ill omen. The Greeks had very strong feelings about unlucky days. So therefore, with meeting more regularly, it attracted a lot more business to it by means of overseeing various city boards, as the Athenians called them. We might call them departments, for example, the Department of Public Works or Department of Energy or something. The Boule came to control the day-to-day administration of the state. Now, whether Kleisthenes realized the potential of the Boule or not, his legislation allowed it to acquire this power and to become composed of a wide section of Attic society. Moreover, and this is even more important because the towns and the tribes were of different sizes and so had different population figures, as we've talked about previously, Kleisthenes assigned the 50 Boule members from each tribe among the demes of each tribe by their population. This system is the closest to proportional representation in the ancient world that we will ever come across. I suspect Kleisthenes did realize the Boule's potential since he saw firsthand how it rallied the people in defying Cleomenes and Isagoras in 508. Remember, it was the Boule, according to the Athenian constitution, that had encouraged the people to resist Cleomenes and Isagoras. It had led the opposition to them. The Boule was far more of a popular organ than the Areopagus. And so Kleisthenes, realizing this, seeing how it interacted with the people, realizing its potential in the constitution, made it the kind of plum council to be a member of. It was not in the best interests of the man who wanted to serve on the Boule to oppress those who lived in his own area, because news of what he was up to would spread to other members, nor was there any point in would-be candidates to the Boule trying to intimidate those who lived in their own areas to vote for them in the election, or indeed to let them stand for the Boule, because now the tribe was Attica-wide. Forcing somebody in your hometown to vote for you, or even to agree to let you to be a candidate, was one thing, but what about those who were part of the tribe and lived all over the place? They were not going to be influenced by this sort of intimidation. But I need to make something clear here, because I keep talking about election to the Boule and about how the candidates came from the tribes. Election to the Boule was not direct. It was by lot. And let me try to explain that. In other words, out of a number of candidates who were put forward for the 50 spots on the Boule, the 50 were selected randomly by lot. It was a sort of arbitrary process. It was like putting, we don't know how many number of candidates put themselves forward, but 150, 200, who knows? Let's say 150 just for sake of argument. 100, it would be like putting 150 names in a hat and you pull out 50. So there's a arbitrary nature to the actual elections. It's not a direct election, it's by lot. But getting yourself named as a candidate was still the tricky part, because you would need to be approved by your tribe as a candidate for election. Therefore, trying to throw your weight around in an area or trying to intimidate someone to vote for you was still not going to redound to your credit. So Kleisthenes widened the socioeconomic composition of the Boule. Non-nobles began to play a role in higher-level state administration. Eventually, there would be state pay for attending and living in Athens for a year to attend the Boule, to be a member of it. That, of course, would open up membership to a larger cross-section of society, the ones who might not be able to serve as members of the Boule, but now could do so because of state pay. That was something that came about in the fully developed democracy. These measures that Kleisthenes implemented, as well as the creation of the deemed assemblies, that is the town assemblies, and then the various offices that were needed to manage them effectively, all meant that the ordinary people throughout Attica gained experience in administration in the city and outside the city. And as I said at an earlier time, I don't think it's too far-fetched to see in Kleisthenes' three-tier hierarchy of deme, that is town assembly, tribal assembly, and then Athenian assembly, the origins of our modern local, state, and federal administration, which all citizens can take part in and do not have to live only in the state capitals, for instance. The Athenian constitution describes Kleisthenes' constitution as, quote, more democratic than that of Solon. I mentioned this when we were wrapping up our analysis of Solon, and I also expressed surprise that the Athenian constitution doesn't say anything about Solon opening up the archonship to non-nobles, or enacting that the assembly would now meet more regularly, and that all citizens, noble and non-noble, could attend it. But now we can see why the Athenian constitution had this view. I foreshadowed it before, because Kleisthenes took democracy to the masses in a way that Solon did not. Solon's constitution expected that the Areopagus and the archons would continue running affairs as before. In time, the composition of archons and Areopagus would alter as non-nobles got elected to office and then became members of the Areopagus. Nevertheless, archons and Areopagus were always going to run things, with the people having a political voice in the assembly. So Solon's constitution really favored only those who were able to attend assemblies in Athens. Now, however, Kleisthenes gave these same people the opportunity to participate in a political system in which all citizens, noble and non-noble, were, in theory at least, equal, and regardless of where they lived in Attica, could take part in some form of state administration. They discussed business that affected them all. They elected their tribal representatives to the Boule. Although the actual election was by lot, as I just said, they still vetted the candidates who were allowed to stand for the Boule, and they supported their tribe and its members. There's some similarities between the modern-day congressman or senator who is elected by his or her constituency and represents the best interests of that constituency, but at the same time knows that he or she is still dependent on that constituency for its support. This wider role of the people in the democratic process and this talk of proportional representation has led many scholars to agree with the Athenian constitution and to take it one step further to call Kleisthenes and not Solon the father of democracy. Well, it's up to you to decide where to stand on that. Kleisthenes did bring political power to the masses far more than Solon did. The Kleisthenic constitution altered political life in a way that Solon had never foreseen. But could Kleisthenes have done what he did without Solon's legislation? Is not the person who starts a process the seminal mover, that is, the father? The Romans might have gotten around to this. The Romans, I'm sure, would have had no problem calling Kleisthenes the father of democracy, because to them, what was important was not the person who invented the thing, but the person who perfected it. But, you know, they certainly had that kind of idea when it came to all of the stuff that they took over from Greece, you know, in terms of literature and philosophy and stuff like that. But this is how some people would get around to calling Kleisthenes the father of democracy and not Solon. Well, perhaps we can have two fathers of democracy, even perhaps Solon and then Kleisthenes. The development of democracy was complicated, after all, and we can't expect one man to have done it all. But then again, one man didn't do it all. And I made that point very clearly, I hope, when I said that Solon started off the process and others followed him. And we'll see the same thing when we deal with the Spartan constitution next week with a man named Lycurgus. He started it off and others added to it. But surely when we use a label like father, we should have only one. Realistically, a child can have more than one father in his life, but only one father biologically. Democracy took a long time to mature, and even in 508 BC, where we are now with Kleisthenes, it was a heck of a long way to go. But we'll see how far it had to go and the dramatic changes that it underwent when we deal with Ephialtes in 462. But if we're going to try to get back to the father as being the originator of something, which is what a father technically is, I'll always stick to my guns in calling Solon the father of democracy. I can acknowledge the immense changes that Kleisthenes made to the Solonian constitution, as well as the changes Ephialtes did, but to me, Solon's the father. Two other innovations of Kleisthenes need to be discussed, though, before we conclude with him. The first was in the military sphere, where Kleisthenes introduced a new office of state. This was called the strategos, or professional general. Until this time, the Polemarchus archon had been in charge of military affairs. But as I said a while ago, it doesn't follow that someone who was born in the right family, the noble family, the Eupatridae, had military competence. And Athens' relations with other states, especially Sparta, were deteriorating now. After all, by 508 BC, the year that we're in at the moment, Sparta had twice invaded Attica, the first time to expel Hippias, and the second time to help Isagoras out. Clearly, then, professional rather than amateur military experience was crucial in any further conflicts. And the strategia, that is the office of generalship, and it always, and of course, it also gives us our word strategy. This had as its prerequisite military experience, and leading on from military experience, the ability to advise on strategy. So therefore, 10 strategoi, or generals, one general from each tribe, remember the 10 new tribes, were elected annually to this position, and re-election ad infinitum was possible. This was important, this re-election, because if Athens were at war, for example, you would want the same generals running things. You would want continuity of policy. Civilian archonships were still annual, but the strategos could be re-elected. For instance, Pericles in the Peloponnesian War, during that period and leading up to it, was elected strategos 15 times. Well, an offshoot of Kleisthenes' introduction of the office of strategos was the creation of other military offices. These included the hipparchos, the cavalry commander, the taxiarchos, the infantry commander, and again, there was one of each of these from each of the tribes. So ultimately, 10 hipparchoi and 10 taxiarchoi. For some reason, the first strategoi weren't elected until 501 BC, 7 years or so after Kleisthenes' legislation. We don't know why there was this gap, but for some reason, the Athenians felt that they didn't need a general until then. Now, the second and final innovation that I want to talk about as far as Kleisthenes is concerned is that of ostracism. Kleisthenes was believed to have introduced this procedure, that is, ostracism, as a constitutional way of expelling would-be tyrants from Athens. This move, then, was to protect the democracy. Perhaps he had somebody like Isagoras in mind. We have to remember how Kleisthenes came to power. At first, he was kicked out of Attica. Remember, we saw the Spartan influence there. That would make sense to want to introduce a professional office of general for future conflicts with Sparta. Would-be tyrants, Isagoras seemed to want to set himself up at the head of an oligarchy. They had to be dealt with. And rather than rely on the Boule and the people in the future to try to expel would-be tyrants or oligarchs, it was wise to have a constitutional mechanism to do this. Of course, also it would involve the assembly, because this was where ostracisms were held. So at a special meeting of the assembly, the people decided whether it wanted to banish someone from Athens for a period of 10 years. This was ostracism. It basically was like an annual anti-popularity contest. And of course, it is where we get our word to ostracize somebody from, to shun them, right, to kick them out of your friend group. Why was it called this, incidentally? Why was ostracism given the name ostracism? Well, because at this assembly, the people were told to write the names of anyone they wanted to get rid of on pieces of pottery. Now, you get a lot of pieces of pottery when you smash a pot on the ground. You get hundreds of shards, and these bits of pottery are called ostraca. So the people of the assembly were given an ostracon, that's the singular of ostraca, and on it they had to write the name of the person they wanted to banish from Athens for 10 years. They then handed in the ostraca inside of a big urn. These were counted, and the one who got the most votes won, so to speak, and had to go into exile for 10 years. He was allowed to return. This wasn't permanent banishment. The whole idea was to kind of cut off any people who were getting to be too powerful in the state. His property was not even confiscated by the state, and his family could still continue to live in Athens. But he himself had to go into exile for a 10-year period. And after that, he could return to Athens, and nobody would make any further moves against him unless he was ostracized again, of course. The first ostracism wasn't held until 488 BC, about 20 years after Kleisthenes' legislation. Again, the reason for the gap isn't completely known. And all the Athenian constitution says is that the people were now confident to use this procedure. This has normally been taken to mean that after 490 BC, which is when the Athenians defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, the people's self-confidence was so great that they used this radical measure for the first time. We'll be talking about Marathon as the prelude to the Persian Wars later on. It's interesting, though, that the first person ostracized, that is in the year 488, was a fellow named Hipparchus, who was a relative of Peisistratid the tyrant, not the son, not the same one. Of course, that one was killed, a different person. And we were told that over the next few years or so, the Athenians just opened the floodgates to ostracisms, and that numerous friends of the tyrants were ostracized easily for the next 4 or 5 years. So once they got used to using the ostracism procedure, the Athenians used it all the time. And this became later on a very convenient political weapon for getting rid of opponents. Now, I'm just going to finish now with a few words of conclusion about Kleisthenes and his legislation and his motives. There is no question that the people benefited thanks to his legislation. But was he a genuine political and social reformer? Or was his legislation a byproduct of his ultimate aim to increase the political power of the Alcmeonidae, that is, his own family? Is it really possible that he didn't realize how much his own family could benefit from what he did? I find it significant that it was only when Kleisthenes lost out to Isagoras in the Archon elections of 509, as we talked about before, that he took the people into his following. He attached them to his group, remember, from the Athenian constitution. To me, wouldn't someone who genuinely wanted to give the people a greater say in political affairs and give them more socioeconomic equality already have the people in his group before standing for the archonship and being elected to it? It's only when he lost out that he took the people into his group. To me, that implies that he really didn't care about them before. But once Isagoras beat him, he had to come up with something pretty smart to win out over Isagoras. Also, in drawing up his blueprint for Attica, Kleisthenes had carte blanche to distribute people into tribes, especially the rival nobles, where he wanted. It's significant when you look at a map of Attica after Kleisthenes that he never affected the power bases of the Alcmeonidae, his own family. These always remained in and around the city, and that meant that the Alcmeonidae always remained a presence in the Athenian assembly and hence in politics. Local government in rural Attica was one thing. Matters affecting the state made by the assembly in Athens were quite another. The power of the Alcmeonidae, therefore, was assured in the city, and that family dominated political life for the next few decades, really down to the time of the Battle of Marathon in 490. Well, if this cynical interpretation is true, and I think it is, then Kleisthenes was a brilliant man who worked for his own ends and those of his family. The fact that the people as a whole benefited was a secondary factor. It is up to you, of course, to decide whether he was a genuine reformer or a con man. And as I said before, it's up to you to decide whether he or Solon should be labeled the father of democracy, or whether we should have two fathers of democracy. But whichever way you go, at least now you know the name or names of the person or people who created democracy. We've come a long way from the era of oligarchic rule and the lack of rights for all citizens, not to mention their enslavement at the hands of their citizens. The power of the people was such now that it was able to rise up against a Spartan invasion in 508 BC, able to expel a Spartan king from the Acropolis, and indeed force the Spartans into submission. Given that we've been bringing Sparta more and more into our lectures, we are now going to turn to them in our next lecture next week. But before we get there, I would like to show you a brief movie that recaps basically everything that we've talked about so far, and in particularly through the lens of Kleisthenes.
(508 BC), 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. In a town called Athens, a tiny city in mainland Greece, pandemonium ruled the streets. The ordinary people had turned on their rulers, demanding freedom from centuries of oppression. At this moment, one man looked on. An Athenian nobleman named Kleisthenes. Kleisthenes had been brought up from birth to be a ruler, to look down on these common people with contempt. But this one night would be a turning point in his life, in the history of Greece, and in the history of civilization. In a flash of inspiration, Kleisthenes would see that these ordinary people should have freedom, a chance to shape their own destiny, to govern themselves. And with this decision, Kleisthenes would set his fellow Greeks on the path to empire. Historians estimate that Kleisthenes was born around 570 BC. He was hardly the type to become a man of the people. From his earliest days, he had been taught that he was an aristocrat. Ancient Greek for a member of the ruling class. In the 6th century BC, these aristocrats controlled everything that happened in Kleisthenes' hometown, a small settlement called Athens. Athens lay in the center of a Mediterranean peninsula which Kleisthenes knew as Hellas, and which we now call Greece. In the days of Kleisthenes' youth, it would have seemed impossible that this city would soon rule an empire.
It certainly is not what we'd call a city. Forget Manhattan. Athens in the center has public buildings, but otherwise I think one should imagine more village style of accommodation and habitation.
The town was built around the Acropolis, a steep-sided outcrop of bare rock, a stronghold from which the Athenians could fend off the attacks of their neighbors. In the narrow streets surrounding the Acropolis huddled the simple homes of farmers and tradesmen. For these Athenians, reading and writing was a rare skill. There was nothing that we might call science or medicine. Life expectancy at birth was less than 15 years.
I think the idea that ancient Greek life was nasty, brutish, and short would be entirely accurate. Certainly, life was extremely tough.
And this was no society of equals. The common Athenians lived under the rule of the aristocrats, men such as Kleisthenes' father.
Athens was, in a sense, turned against itself. You had one part of the population, the aristocratic elite, holding power at the expense of the rest of the citizen population.
For the Greek writer Aristotle, this was a world riven by injustice.
The whole country was in the hands of a few people. The hardest and bitterest thing for the masses was their state of serfdom. Not that they weren't discontented with anything else, for to speak generally, they had no part nor share in anything.
Dominated by aristocrats interested only in preserving their own power, Athens hardly seemed a state on the verge of building a great empire. But then Greece also seemed an unlikely land to give rise to greatness.
If you look at the physical world of Greece, it's not the kind of place that you'd immediately expect to produce a great civilization. Simply too many mountains. Greece does not have the obvious kind of physical unity that typically seems to be associated with the really great imperial civilizations of the ancient world.
The great civilizations of Kleisthenes' day lay to the south and east, in Egypt and Persia. They had grown up around rivers, and the fertile plains stretching from their banks. But mainland Greece had no great rivers or open plains. This was a landscape riven by mountain ranges. Off her coast lay countless tiny islands. It was impossible for a single ruler to dominate this fragmented world. Instead, Greece was divided into countless tiny nations called city-states, each fiercely independent, each with its own culture and history. And Kleisthenes Athens was not nearly the most powerful or important of these tiny nations. Argos had stood for over 1,000 years. Her citizens were able to trace their history back to the mythical days of the Trojan War. The Corinthians dominated Greek trade. Their ships plied the Mediterranean, ferrying goods back and forth from Egypt, Assyria, and Italy. But there was one city-state which had military power, which appeared that it might come to dominate all of Kleisthenes Greece. In the south of Greece, around the reed beds of the river Eurotas, lay the city-state of Sparta. The Spartans were brought up from birth to be soldiers, raised in the field, separated from their families, their lives structured around discipline and war.
The center of an average Spartan man's life was his barracks, and he was brought up to be a military man.
The Spartans lived a life stripped of comforts, with few possessions apart from their weapons, and their cloaks dyed red to conceal their or their victims' blood.
Spartans were brought up to put up with anything, and all sorts of stories, the best being of a visiting Sybarite visiting Sparta, eating the local food, and saying now he understood why the Spartans were so willing to die, because death was as nothing to eating their food.
The Spartans were ruthless expansionists. By Kleisthenes' time, they had conquered all of the surrounding regions, more than 4,000 square miles. For the rest of the Greeks, the Spartans were a threat always on the horizon. This, then, was the world of Kleisthenes' childhood. Brought up a member of a self-interested elite in a state that was only a third-rate power. It was an unlikely beginning for the man who would set Greece on the path to empire. But then Kleisthenes had always been a man fired by a dream. A uniquely Greek vision of the greatness a man could achieve. If there was one thing that inspired Kleisthenes and his fellow Greeks, it was their stories, ancient tales and myths. The country was continually crisscrossed by hundreds of traveling bards who recited these tales to whoever would pay. These traveling bards would have regularly visited the Athens of Kleisthenes' childhood, and their stories would have influenced and shaped him from his earliest days. The two most famous tales these singers told are still preserved: the Iliad and the Odyssey, composed by the legendary poet Homer. These works tell of mighty battles and epic struggles. And at their heart lie the heroes. Mythical figures whose strength had won them power and glory.
Heroes, almost by definition, were doers of great deeds. The more heads you knocked and the more young women that you deflowered, the greater your heroic status. Heroes were terrific achievers.
Images of heroes are found all over Greek art. These warlike figures, valiant, beautiful, determined to seize victory at all costs, were the Greek ideal. This, the vision of the hero, the ideal of the man of action, was the model that Kleisthenes was brought up to follow. To pursue a life of greatness and glory, won through strength and valor. To seize power and victory for himself and himself alone. To become a real-life hero. But Kleisthenes was not the only one to take the tales of the mythical heroes to heart.
There's a big change in the middle of the 6th century when one man seizes control of the government as what the Greeks called a tyrant.
The story of how this tyrant or sole ruler came to power has been preserved by the historian Herodotus. One day, a man of dignified and noble bearing rode into the city of Athens. Beside him stood a tall and beautiful woman. A woman he claimed was the patron goddess of Athens, Athena. This dashing figure demanded that he be given the rule of Athens, for like one of Homer's heroes, he had the protection of a goddess. Surprisingly, he was welcomed by the Athenians as their new ruler, despite the fact that the goddess was simply a particularly tall girl from a neighboring village. And the heroic figure was an ordinary man called Peisistratid, Kleisthenes' own brother-in-law.
Peisistratid was, I think, an excellent politician. He was a man, without doubt, with an eye for the main chance.
But as he consolidated his rule, it became clear that Peisistratid had far greater ambitions than simply gaining power.
Peisistratid was an extremely intelligent man. He clearly understood that if he was going to maintain control of Athens, if he was going to be able to consolidate his rule and pass it on to his sons, which is clearly his ambition, he would have to find allies.
Peisistratid took an extraordinary step. He turned to the common Athenians for support, undermining the whole hierarchy of aristocrats and commoners that had endured for centuries. Peisistratid reduced taxes and introduced free loans to allow the people to build up their farms. And by offering the Athenians the chance of prosperity, Peisistratid began to transform his city.
With the rise of Peisistratid, we start to see the success of agrarianism accelerated at Athens. And that's going to be a kernel that's going to grow and grow and grow in the ensuing 2 centuries. And one of the results of that is we see more vines and olives. Olive trees manifest themselves in every aspect of Greek culture. Economically, they allow people to have cooking oil, they allow people to eat olives, they allow people to use lubricants, soap, fuel, so it's a very valuable economic commodity.
The land around Athens produced excellent olives, the best in the Greek world. And as production soared, the Athenians found a ready market for this oil. Not only in the other Greek states, but across the sea, in Egypt and Phoenicia, Persia and Assyria.
Greece is in the middle of an extraordinary grouping of ancient civilizations. It's bounded on the east by the great Persian Empire, on the south by the age-old civilization of Egypt, on the west, the Etruscans and the Romans. Greeks were scattered. Plato has a rather nice phrase, like ants or frogs round a pond.
The Eastern Mediterranean was the greatest marketplace of the ancient world. It seemed that everyone had something to sell. Grain from Scythia, salt fish from the Black Sea, wine from the great vineyards of the island of Chios, gold, silver, art, and finery from Egypt. And everyone was willing to trade for Athenian olive oil. As goods flowed in and out of the Athenian harbor, the Athenians found their wealth and prosperity on the rise. But the most astonishing consequence of Athens' sudden expansion was to be found in the darkest streets of the city. Athens' first great artistic legacy, the vase.
I think what's fascinating about the pottery is that in its own time, it wasn't a big deal artistically. What was inside the pots was almost invariably worth more than the pot itself.
Here in the area known as the Keramikos, ancient Athens' red light district, could also be found the potters' workshops. These common artisans were amongst the lowest of the low in Athenian society.
If you were a potter in Athenian society, I won't say you were the scum of the earth, but you certainly had no especial respect. It was hard, incessant work, unenvied by the citizen population.
Pottery had been a staple across the ancient world for hundreds of years, used in the kitchen at home and for transporting oils and food. But it had always been simple in design, using geometric patterns and basic figures, designs based on Egyptian and Assyrian art. But Athenian potters, as they decorated their work, began to develop a whole new style of painting. A freshness and a naturalism never before seen. A style still astonishing today.
It's now become almost commonplace for a Greek vase on the modern antiquities market to fetch millions of dollars or pounds. And if the makers of those vases had any idea of what we were shelling out for them, their graves would spin with either resentment or just absolute hilarity.
These Athenian potters seem to have been motivated not by the idea of producing great art for eternity, but of outdoing each other. On one particularly fine vase, we find the proud comment,
Euthymides, son of Polias, drew this.
and then underneath,
And I'll bet Euphronius couldn't have managed it.
for the first time in their history, the ordinary Athenians had tasted freedom, and they had shown their capacity for extraordinary achievement. Kleisthenes grew to manhood under Peisistratid rule. And he saw how Athens changed. His home had turned from a modest rural settlement into an international economic power. But Peisistratid's rule of benevolent tyranny was not to last forever. In the year 527 BC, he died and was laid to rest here in the Athenian graveyard. His son Hippias took over. At first, Hippias followed in his father's footsteps, ruling Athens with a fair hand. But soon, the Athenians discovered the perilous nature of tyranny. Historians tell us that in the year 514 BC, Hippias' brother was murdered. Aggrieved and bitter, the tyrant's behavior completely changed. Hippias not only executed the murderers, but cruelly tortured one of their wives to death as well. Aristotle described the ruler's slide towards madness.
After this, the tyranny became much, much harsher, for Hippias ordered numerous executions and sentences of exile in revenge for his brother. And he became embittered and suspicious of everybody.
The freedoms that the common Athenians had gained under Peisistratid were now stripped away.
There was now a real tyranny in the modern sense in Athens. Peisistratid had come into power for a cause. His son now had no cause other than self-preservation.
Life for Kleisthenes had now become increasingly dangerous. For the paranoid dictator knew that it was from here, from the aristocrats, that the greatest threat to his power could come. And Hippias' fears would be proved right.
With the hardening of the attitude of the tyranny, the time now seemed to be ripe.
Kleisthenes decided to take his first great gamble. He would try to overthrow Hippias, to gain power for himself and his family.
Kleisthenes' ambition to make his mark upon the scene is something that, of course, would have been impressed on him from a very early age. From the stories of the heroes, that they need to succeed and to strike at the right time. For Kleisthenes himself, it would be an achievement.
Kleisthenes assembled a conspiracy to overthrow the tyrant. Hippias was trapped in his stronghold, captured and banished from Athens forever. The year was 510 BC, and Kleisthenes was now one of the most powerful figures in Athens. He had lived up to the heroic myths he'd been brought up to follow since childhood. But Greek society was changing. The heroic urge that drove Kleisthenes was no longer reserved for the elite. It was now permeating every level of Greek society. This is Olympia in southern Greece. Here, once every 4 years, men from across the Greek world would gather to compete in a vast contest of athletic skill. This was the ancestor of the modern Olympic Games. The competitions had been founded in 776 BC, 2 centuries before Kleisthenes had even been born. Then they had been an exclusive competition for the wealthiest of the Greeks. But by Kleisthenes' time, the games had evolved to allow anyone to take part. A nobleman could now race against a potter, a king against a fishmonger.
The Olympic Games were a chance for any Greeks to display the sort of heroic qualities that the heroes of Homer had displayed.
The competitions had their roots in the skills displayed by the mythical heroes. Chariot racing, running, wrestling, boxing. But here there was no real prize, just a wreath of olives and fame throughout Greece.
A competitor would be surrounded by the largest gathering of Greeks in peace that he would ever experience. Perhaps as many as 40,000 Greeks would gather for the Olympic Games.
Greeks would travel hundreds of miles to attend the Olympics. And during the festival, the land surrounding the stadiums would be covered with encampments. But for the Greek man, whatever his origin or class, to win here would be the highlight of his life.
You had, briefly, a moment of glory, of extreme fame, which was what the competitive culture of the Greeks valued so highly.
Here the Greeks had perhaps found a civilized way to satisfy the heroic ideal. They had built a meritocracy based on skill and ability, where anyone could win. But a world where everyone could seize victory could only make Athens even more unstable. As soon as Kleisthenes gained power, he found that others were conspiring against him. Here, heroism still meant one thing: seize power whenever and however you can.
The only rule is that you get what you can and that you fight. You have to go in there and show that you can win.
The most ambitious of those conspiring against Kleisthenes was a man named Isagoras. Isagoras was another Athenian aristocrat. He too had been brought up to believe that power was his right. But Isagoras also knew that he could not gain power on his own. Isagoras took an unprecedented step. He turned outside Athens for support. He sent a message to the Spartans, Greece's most feared warriors. Isagoras was an old friend of the Spartans. Rumor had it that he had shared his wife with the Spartan king. The Spartans immediately provided a force of their finest troops to back up Isagoras' bid for power, to help him betray his city.
Isagoras really was upping the stakes. He brought in the most powerful state in Greece. It was pretty clear he was going to turn Athens into a subject state to Sparta.
With his Spartan force, Isagoras staged a coup, seizing control of Athens. He and his troops would rule from the high point of the city, the stronghold atop the Acropolis. The first targets of the new tyrant were the other aristocrats. Kleisthenes most of all. Over 700 households were cast out of Athens, including Kleisthenes and his entire family. Kleisthenes would leave his city living once again under the hand of a despotic dictator. A dictator who now ruled with the support of the most fearsome power in Greece, the Spartans. For Kleisthenes, all his childhood lessons seemed betrayed. He had been brought up to be an aristocrat and a ruler. To emulate the mythical heroes. But all this had led to was conflict and feuding, death and exile, power struggles amongst an aristocratic elite. How could Athens ever escape from this pointless cycle of violence? But even as Kleisthenes agonized in exile, Athens was rocked by an extraordinary event. Like their mythical heroes, the ordinary people of Athens now took their destiny into their own hands. They rose up in revolution. Pythagoras and his Spartan allies blockaded themselves atop the Acropolis, the high point of the city. But even there, they could not escape the fury of the common Athenians. For 2 days and nights, Pythagoras held out against this extraordinary uprising. Until finally, on the morning of the third day, he was forced to surrender. The year was 508 BC. This would be Athens' first step to empire and glory. For the first time in recorded history, the people had turned on their rulers and seized power for themselves.
Athens at this point is in control of the mob, the ordinary people who had risen up without organized leadership, and then the question is, what happens now?
At this new dawn, the Athenian people now turned to one man. A figure whose life, whose experiences and disappointments had given him a unique vision. Kleisthenes was recalled from exile and asked to build a government.
When Kleisthenes returned to Athens after the expulsion of the Spartans, he faced a really remarkable challenge. There was no possibility for just simply putting back in power a group of aristocrats. There was no possibility for him to declare himself tyrant. In a sense, what Kleisthenes had to do is design a revolutionary governmental solution for a revolutionary political situation.
For Kleisthenes, the problem was how to give his fellow Athenians the say in their future that he knew they must now have. On an Athenian hillside, he had a great meeting place carved out from the bare rock. Here, in the shadow of the Acropolis, the citizens of Athens could now gather to discuss the future of their state. On these very steps, rich and poor alike could stand and address their fellow citizens. This is the ancestor of the British House of Commons, the American Congress, of parliaments across the world. And where government had once been decided by the strength of a sword arm or the thrust of a sharpened spear, Kleisthenes instituted the simple vote. A white pebble for yes, a black pebble for no. And with this elegant and simple idea, Kleisthenes instituted the rule of the people. A system of government which we now know as democracy. The Great Athenian Assembly would gather every 9 days to vote on issues covering the entire administration of the state, from the raising of taxes to the building of roads, from the price of figs to the declaration of war.
Athenian democracy is a very different sort of democracy from ours. One has a sense, as an Athenian citizen, that you really can make a difference. There is no us and them. There is no government separate from the ordinary Athenian citizen body. They are the government. Democracy represented a sharp break. An originally elitist, heroic culture was now turned on its head, and the idea was that even ordinary Greeks who weren't aristocratic, who were not rich, could be, as it were, heroes in politics.
It was a system of government that would transform this tiny state and would set off one of the greatest flowerings of civilization the world had ever seen.
It's not just an accident that you had democracy and you had this tremendous flourishing of culture. I think that democracy really does, in a very real way, unleash, make possible potentials within human societies that are very unlikely to be unleashed, to be made actual in any other way.
But it would not be Kleisthenes' task to lead Athens onto her greatest days. For a new generation of Athenians would take up his legacy.